Thank you very much, Michael. A lot of very interesting things to discuss, and I would now open the stage to the audience. If you would like to raise your virtual hand. I'm actually happy to start myself, but no, I see Mark Fleurbet, please.
Yeah, I was hoping I would not be the first again. So I really like that, and I really enjoyed this idea of the coordination in the Schelling way. That's really great. And so I have two questions. One is, could we imagine on this basis some way of nudging people in the formulation of the question to think in these terms, to think in giving an answer that can be properly interpreted by other people, rather than giving whatever they think. And so that's my first question. The second question is, we could think of this coordination happening in different groups. So I'm thinking of the Latino effect, for instance, where there seems to be a different use of the middle of the grade. 6 is the same in Latin American countries as 5 is in other countries. So so it might be a different coordination on something, but it could also happen in social groups. So if you have any views on that, thanks.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting, in addition to the sort of things I mentioned, to ask people, how do you think you are trying to answer questions? Are you trying to have answers to other people? Do you think other people are trying to? So yeah, I think but what I like about this is that at least it kind of gives you a theory of where to look if you're trying to look at different scale interpretation. So yeah, it seems quite possible that people might, they given who they think is answering the question, they think, okay, we're going to meet at that bakery rather than Grand Central Station. I think that's pretty plausible and merits further investigation.
Thank you. If I can, actually, I'd like to add something to Mark Fleurbet's question, which is with some colleagues, we try to formulate a question in this sense, and the question was not exactly, probably won't remember exactly how it was phrased, but it was in the term of how do you think other people would rate a certain vignette, so vignette to establish what's the common scale, and how do you think other people would rate your life satisfaction? So as to induce an external focus, which joins Michael's point of essentially being a coordination problem about one being able to convey. It's probably, for sure, it's a second or third best, but it could be an idea. Nick, please.
Well, I thought Alois got his hand up first, so I'll let Alois ask first, and then I'll ask Mike.
I'm sorry.
You might not see him on the screen.
I only see Nick.
Yeah.
But yeah, please, Alois.
Maybe just two brief remarks. First, I think I like very much your presentation, and then also at the end, the suggestions that you brought up in exploring these issues. And actually, I would really start with asking people to reflect about how they report, rather than to provide them with alternatives and ask which way are you reporting, because maybe they have not reflected and, oh yes, this sounds enough sophisticated for me to fit my self-image of myself as a PhD in economics. So I would definitively go first for this first alternative, and then maybe derive from this some ways, and then ask people whether they this feels how they respond, to get an idea whether there is a maturity of whether there are camps, or whether there is a cultural tradition that people choose one or the other method. Then I also liked the critical way or the critical junctions in your presentation, that you said, oh, if this does not hold, then we cannot do much. maybe you have been too critical, because I guess you could also imagine to have 2 responses of the same person within a year. And you might want to learn from this person's answers over time. And then maybe, yeah, you would like to have internal stability and monotonicity. But in order to detect an improvement, for example. And so I liked it, but I think maybe you gave up too early on what we can learn if we have less perfect measures.
Yeah, so I think I'm more optimistic than you think I am. So with the thing that I think derails the project is if you don't think the underlying phenomenon is perceivable in units of intensity. But I just think basically all subjective phenomena are perceivable in intensity. But if you're doing the economist thing, when you think you're trying to, the reason you're asking about life satisfaction is because you're asking for people's how they're ranking their life, sort of their ranking of preferences. The preferences are necessarily ordinal. So if what you really want is an ordering of preferences, then yeah, you couldn't get a cardinal measure out of that. But I think if we're interested in people's psychological experiences, then those are the kind of thing that we can that are perceivable in intensity. And then the kind of the point is really to the skeptic to say, okay, I've given you 3 places where this could be broken. Like, tell me where you think it deviates from cardinality. Tell me how much you think it deviates. Because if you think, say, happiness is perceivable in units of intensity, then the measures are going to be wrong in some way, and then you could work out how to make them not wrong. So yeah, and then you can have a slightly more useful conversation about like what you think is how you think the measures are deviating from cardinality.
Thank you. I think Nick rose his hand, and Miriam Sprangers as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michael, for the interesting presentation. I guess one of the yardsticks that we use a lot as empirical economists is that whether or not this badly measured data predicts anything useful, like behaviors. And we know that even though, when people are asked about their job satisfaction, their life satisfaction, it's got this amazing power of prediction, right? On whether or not we're going to stay in our marriage, whether we're going to quit our jobs. So my question is, do you think by improving the way people, interpret these questions, we can also improve the way these subjective well-being measures can predict behavior as well?
I'm going to turn off my video because Alberto suggested that might improve my audio. I don't really have a view on that, but I suppose the answer is yes. If you think you can better measure something and you think that thing is predictive of something else, then you'd expect to be more kind of accurate in the prediction.
Okay, because I think that would be something that policymakers would really care about, because they want to know whether by improving the measures, the priority of the things that we, whether well-being predicts quitting or earning more money more, whether it shifts in terms of the ranking. So that would be useful things to know, I think. So thank you.
Miriam Sprangers.
Thank you. I would like to say 3 things. I want to do them briefly. The first, I believe it's Tyler or Mark said and suggested the idea of nudging. I like that idea, but it all depends on the research question, whether nudging is appropriate or not. And I believe Mark said we are dealing with inherently evaluative, subjective measures, and provided they are, nudging would not be possible. And the other thing I would like to raise is I have done a guided or supervised PhD study who conducted think aloud interviews with people completing a questionnaire, a subjective questionnaire, trying to get at that temporality third, how do you say it, that Mark said, one of the conditions that need to be met. And what we found was that people used, we use a cognitive framework that was in part being led, so to speak, and Carolyn will talk about that more later in her presentation. And we found that people for any different item and over time used really very different cognitive appraisals. So there was no way we could discern any logic behind it. So one of the papers was also framed as, the title was, "A long walk was shorter after radiotherapy than before." So people reframed the topics, the rating skills, and anything. And one final point I would like to make in favor of Michael's optimism. I'm not going to downplay the problems we face. They're huge. But what surprises me so much is that many of our subjective measures are so robust. For example, overall quality of life or symptoms are very strong predictors of survival above and beyond clinical parameters. So somehow, whatever people do in their minds, it works. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I have this sort of this suspicion that people's skepticism of subjective well-being measures comes from the fact we try and put numbers on feelings. But if you ask people, but then we have no problem in using verbal labels that describe how we feel. So do you feel excellent? Do you feel terrible? So these are completely unproblematic, but there seems to be some mental skepticism that once you put things up, so that we understand that we can communicate with each other, but somehow feel disbelieving about kind of numbers and precision. And then I think regarding the second point, it depends a bit on what it is you care about. So what you care about is how people feel, and when you ask people, they're telling you, over some different time period, but they're using the same sorts of time periods when they ask these questions in general. Then the information they're still going to give you, relevant information about how they feel. But it might make more differences if you're taking kind of a different philosophical view on why you want to know the answer to those questions.
Thank you, Michael. I saw a sign by Mark.
Tyler should go first.
Tyler, sorry, since I don't see all the screens on, please.
Thank you, Michael, for an interesting presentation. I found the notion that people are intentionally trying to report cardinally really quite intriguing, and there does seem something right about it. So I really enjoyed that. Two questions. One, I was wondering if you could make some remarks on the interpersonality and whether people have the same ends of the stick. Is someone who's in really terrible situation going to have a better sense as to what a one is than I might, for example? So I was just curious. You had said you wouldn't have time to go into that, but if you have an opportunity to offer further remarks on that point, I'd be very curious. And then second, kind of going back to this question of whether there is an underlying latent univariate mental state that we're trying to assess. I guess what do you make of the phenomena that if you ask about life satisfaction, you'll get similar but slightly different responses than, say, with Cantrell's ladder? I mean, is it simply different ways of trying to formulate the ultimate question? Is there an underlying ultimate question that could be asked, or how do you think about that within your framework?
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm just going to try and share this because it's slightly bonus slides. So I'll answer your second question first. So I mean, it's clear that there is something very slightly different about life satisfaction and the Cantrell ladder. So you might expect there to be some differences. But I mean, I guess I would like to know a bit more about, and I don't think we have much of a good theory of this, as to kind of what's going on exactly with that. But we can kind of tell a story about relating affective measures to evaluations as to why we think they're going to be different, which seems somewhat plausible. Okay, so on the on your first question, so this I think is interesting, but I don't think what I have on my screen is interesting, but not maybe very conclusive. So this is Cantril ladder from across the world. Okay, so what are we expecting to see if people are using the ends of the scale as the actual limit, as the realistic limits for endpoint? Okay, so you see there's a normal distribution-ish, quite a lot happening around number 5. This graph looks a little bit like a middle finger. But we also notice that the whole range of the scale is being used. Now, if we expected people to use the endpoints to refer to logical possibilities, just for sake of argument, then everyone's scores would be compressed right into the middle. Equally, if people were using the endpoints to refer to their sub-realistic limit, the 10 out of 10 is not the happiest you've ever been, then you'd expect a bunching at the ends. But what we see is that people use the whole range of the scale, and in fact, people's experiences are necessarily within the whole real range. So it looks, in broad terms, the individuals are using the real limits. But it's consistent with this being broadly the case that this wouldn't hold for lots of subgroups. And so then so I won't go into this because there's not time, but I mean, essentially the challenge is, do people change their scales or do they really adapt? And then there's these questions of group differences, and yeah, I don't think I have time to talk about those. But on the bits of evidence there are, it looks like people are roughly don't change their scales over time, and it seems like there is a more of a universal sense of scale. But I mean, that's just a promissory note rather than an actual explanation.
Thank you, Michael. Mark, I don't know if you had a remark. Otherwise, please, or to the other, don't hesitate to use your virtual hand.
Thanks, Alberto, and thanks, Michael. So I really like this linguistic element, and I think that's maybe underappreciated in the more mathematical perspectives on this stuff. At the same time, I think we could spend a bit more time thinking about what it is that people are trying to communicate. So I'm very stuck on this idea, perhaps because I'm Australian and we have certain cultural conventions that you would just say you're 8 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 because you want to communicate that your life's going pretty well, but it could be better. And there's just not much more in that statement. So assuming linearity from that is problematic, and it would be interesting to just unpack those kind of things a bit more, including from the perspective of who are you trying to be understood by? So if I'm trying to communicate with another Australian, that's as far as it's going to get. It'd be very rude in Australia if someone asked you how you're going and you said, "Oh, terrible." That would be a highly unusual cultural incident. So it's interesting to think about whether in trying to communicate with another citizen, you would respond differently to if you're trying to communicate with a researcher, and what the kind of social desirability dynamics are. So with a researcher, you might be sophisticated enough to realize that they want you to maintain a consistent scale over time. But with your average citizen in the street, you don't do the same thing. So it'd be nice to unpack that a bit. And then I think relatedly, this idea that you want your 7 out of 10 to roughly mean the same thing as other people's 7 out of 10. I think I concur with that. But again, there's this issue of well, my 7 out of 10 means that life's going pretty well, but it could be better. And in the context of a lot of the research around the World Values Survey or something, I'm not sure that 7 out of 10 that a rural Indian peasant says is commensurate to an accountant in Sunderland or something like that, even though they might both give you a 7 out of 10. And yeah, so anyway, I'm very curious about the finesse applications of this stuff in policy.
I think I'd rather be an Indian peasant than an accountant in Sunderland, but maybe our views of well-being just differ. Yeah, I mean, I think this is, at the risk of tooting my own horn, I think what's nice about it is it gives more structured perspectives thinking about it. And yeah, so my hunch would be that if someone's gone to all the trouble of collecting this stupid survey, that they probably do care about the answers. So you probably try a bit harder. When your mate asks you how do you feel, it's kind of a greeting. If your really good mate asks you how do you feel, you might give them a proper answer. So there are some kind of the social dynamics in play. And I'm sorry, your yeah. So regarding the kind of the two different people, I mean, I think I would have more sympathy with the view that everyone says they're an 8 out of 10 and it's just people saying something for the sake of saying it, if actually we did see this. But I mean, as just noted, you do get the full distribution of scores even in countries where things should be going pretty well. I think where this comes down to again is a bit like, well, why do you care about the answers to these questions? I mean, I find it plausible that an accountant in Sunderland is as happy as an Indian peasant, and so the fact they say 7 out of 7 is an accurate piece of information about how their lives are going with respect to their happiness. But if I'm taking a different view of well-being, if I'm sort of putting on my Amartya Sen hat and thinking about capabilities, I might think that the person who's chosen to become an accountant has a deeply impoverished view of what the good life involves, and so they're getting it wrong. But that's because I put on a different philosophical hat.
Grisha Perino, please.
Thanks, Michael. I liked a lot of kind of the stuff in your talk, and also the linguistic approach. And I think also I really have doubts about each and every step or assumption that you make. I think what you do is kind of you help us understand why those numbers we get are not completely nuts. So people are trying, most likely. The question is that good enough to draw the conclusions we're drawing, kind of doing the statistical analysis we're doing, or is there too much, not only noise, but really bias in there? And exactly, yeah, on each and every of those assumptions you raised, I have doubts. But I think it's exactly the challenge to try to figure that out. A few other remarks. You in one of your answers, you mentioned that maybe people are reluctant to put numbers on feelings, while economists put numbers and even dollar signs on essentially anything. So at least from the economist perspective, I think that's not the issue. And a completely different thing is kind of what happens if you ask people about kind of their life satisfaction, and we've done a dedicated survey on life satisfaction with a panel of drawing people from a panel from a professional survey institute, and we had a little question at the end, kind of, oh, just tell us whatever comes to your mind regarding this survey, and really a lot of them said, oh, finally someone cares about us, and it's not just this stupid marketing stuff or whatever. So they were really glad that we asked them how they felt. So they really liked that, and they engaged with that survey. So I found that very motivating and interesting, an interesting response. Not sure whether kind of that really is enough to kind of to get to this Schelling thing, that they really communicate in the same way. Because if I remember kind of my own experience of communications, yes, some people try, but very often communication fails, even among people that really try. Kind of if I talk to colleagues from other disciplines, I really try to understand them and they try to understand me, but we just happen to use the same words for different things and the other way around. So yes, it kind of works, but is it good enough? I think that's a key issue that we're trying to sort out here. But I really like kind of some of your ideas. Thanks.
Yeah. So as the philosopher and not the social scientist, this is the point at which I say, over to you guys. Work it out for me. So I think there's when we got these issues about scale interpretation, like I said, there's kind of 3 places it can go wrong, and what we want to do is quantify how much it goes wrong. So it might be it's quite noisy, but just on average it's fine. It's approximately linear. People are approximately using the real limit, and then so we don't need to worry about it. But maybe we do need to have real concerns, and I think we kind of ought to try and look for those things. I mean, just on the economist one, I mean, economists put numbers on all sorts of things, but economists are really skeptical of feeling. And and this comes out of kind of Pareto and Lionel Robbins in the sort of the early 20th century. This idea of like, look, we can't possibly assess these sorts of things, and so that's, I think there's a kind of a historical skepticism that economists bring to this, which psychologists, for instance, don't. I think that speaks to the disciplinary divide, sort of quirks of intellectual history.
We are 2 minutes from 3, so I would suggest a concluding question by Véronique Sébille.
Thank you. I was wondering when I saw your last slides about, well, what if cardinality is not verified? And I thought that maybe lack of linearity, for example, might be more the rule than the exception, don't you think, when you ask people about their feelings? And because you don't have actually, I mean, very rarely, I'm afraid, interval measurement, meaning that a unit difference doesn't mean the same thing at the different level of the scale. And I wonder whether this is not like something we can expect, because yeah, when you have self-report and you ask about feelings, for example, well, this is really something that I think we will encounter quite often, if not always. And maybe the question would be to see what we can do with this, because this is interesting, and how we can manage such data and take into account the fact that you don't have maybe linearity, or that it is very rare that you have it. And so try to take this into account and to maybe adjust for it if you can. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on this, because I'm afraid you won't have much cardinality in such measures.
Yeah, so just on linearity, I mean, that was the only one I showed you the evidence for, but I just think it's quite hard to believe that scale reporting does deviate substantially from linearity for some of the kind of reasons I gave. I mean, but there's sort of another thing, which is the one question you might wonder about is, okay, is happiness perceived in units? Okay, and then when people try and report their happiness, are they even trying to report it in a linear way? Maybe they are trying, but they're nevertheless failing. So you might think that people kind of have the intention, but it goes wrong. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I would like to see this investigated further, but I don't know. I'd sort of be interested to see how self-reports systematically deviate from linearity. Some more surveys could investigate that sort of thing. But kind of where I said this was tentative deliberately. I think there's kind of evidence supporting the condition, and there's nothing which strongly disconfirms them. But the evidence isn't really robust.
Thank you very much. I said it was the last question, but there's a very, very last question because I missed Magdalena's hand. So please, Magdalena.
Yes, thank you, Alberto. I'll be brief. So I was just wondering how this whole issue about comparability between measures of subjective well-being, especially between different settings that at different economic levels or different developmental levels, how does intertwine with the idea of adaptive preference formation? So on the one hand, we can say that the peasant and the accountant, to follow that same example, give the same score because they genuinely value things differently. So the peasant might value more, I don't know, being in touch with nature, whether the accountants values more, I don't know, generating wealth, economic wealth. Or is it because the peasant, for instance, did value generating wealth, but the lack of realizing that he cannot achieve that, or that they kind of realized the possibility, so they ended up downgrading the value put in that aspect of life. So I was just wondering how can we, I mean, that would give us completely different solutions in terms of policy making. So how does intertwine this these two issues of comparability and the adaptive presence formation theory?
Okay, thanks for that. So again, I think it depends what it is you think ultimately matters. So let's say you think happiness is what ultimately matters, and they both tell you 7 out of 10. A further question you can ask is, are they using their scales in the same way? And you might think they're not, okay? And you've got this further theory that they're not even, you know, they have different concepts of what the best and worst states of happiness are, or, you know, there's systematic non-linearity. And if that's the case, then, you know, they've told you they're as happy as each other, but really they're not. And then if you care about happiness, then you want to correct that measurement issue. But then if you take this, if you're not interested in happiness, like, you know, you're interested in the kind of the Amartya Sen type stuff, then you're thinking, well, look, they are just as happy, but one of them, life is going much better than the other, but that's because it's not happiness, which is what constitutes well-being. So depending on what you're interested in, you know, you may be concerned with the measurement thing, you may not.
Thanks.